Hi, everybody. This is a very different audience than the one I spoke to in Copenhagen yesterday, which was the head and members of NATO. You all look very different. I don't look different, though. But I think that's interesting, right? Yesterday, the head and member states of NATO wanted to learn about design. And they wanted to learn how IBM has scale design. We actually have 1,600 formally trained designers working at IBM today, from about 75 in 2012. And you all are here at a conference that is, by and large, if not dedicated to the notion of design, certainly design is a huge part of the fabric of what this show is about. And I don't think that's an accident. You all have heard, I'm going to try not to repeat things that you all have heard for years in design conferences, that this is the golden era of design. It is the golden era of design. I believe it's not necessarily the golden era, maybe because other people do. It's not because in 2007 a great device was introduced to the world and all of a sudden design, design, design. I think it's actually a more strategic response to what is happening in the world in the 21st century. The 20th century is the story of commoditizing everything. And it was scaled through process. And today we have very different drivers impacting us, both commercially as well as socially. One is the need for differentiation, and the other is the need for speed. So what I want to do today is take my time and kind of walk you through a few stories and kind of tell you how I think about it. And that was my clicker, and that was supposed to click. So we'll start kind of in 2012. My company, IBM, faced a really disruptive environment. It was driven entirely by new people that we didn't have relationships, the actual users of our products, not the buyers of our products and services. We had to navigate new routes to market, primarily cloud-based, and we had very different, changing economies of scale. We had to do better. We had to do faster. In a sentence, we had to become smarter and swifter at our decision-making. And to me, that's design. It gives us a scalable framework to make smarter, faster decisions. And I don't care what we do in the world, whether we're in commercial enterprises, whether we work for the government, or whether we're at an NGA, whatever we do, the need for smarter, faster decision-making is paramount to everything we do. And I believe that design is the single most effective lever at achieving that goal. I'll tell you my story. I started my first startup in 1984. I am not a formally trained designer. I started a startup because I got very passionate about this whole personal computer thing that was happening, and I thought they were going to become a pretty big deal. And at the time, I had to just build software that was so engaging. By the way, that's a modern word. I didn't use that word then, but build software that was so engaging that people would put up with the ridicule of having one of these devices on their desks, because that's what it was like in 1984. You were ridiculed if you were a professional and had a computer at your desk. And over the next 20 years, I did two more. I've done 3 startups. I kind of assumed in 2010, when we were purchased by IBM, I kind of figured that startup number 4 was out there in my future. That's just kind of how I perceived myself. But what was interesting was, in the late 1980s, after staying up until 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning of my team of programmers and me who were writing our software, I stumbled into some of the people that were at the forefront of modern digital design methods, persona-driven development, things like that. The beginnings of design thinking. IDEO itself was created in the early 1990s when Moggridge and Kelly got together. And it blew my mind. And I realized then, click, back, there you go. I discovered that there was a formal process for scaling outcomes that mattered and doing it quickly. And this thing was called design. It sped things up. You could say that design is this framework for smarter, swifter decision making. When I got to IBM in 2010, I was asked to take over the division that had purchased my company. And this small division, small for IBM, had about 45 products in it. And it was making some hundreds of millions in the marketplace. And I was asked to take it over, and I was asked to actually bring the practices of design and design thinking into this unit. And over the next 18 months, we designed a portfolio from 45 products down to 4, and we roughly doubled our presence in the marketplace in a market that was growing about 10% a year. And so 18 months after I started doing this, this was the business case. And I was asked by our chairman at the time, what you did there, click, do it everywhere. Sorry for the AV issues. And I said, I have no idea how to do that, but let's give it a go. Who had ever imagined that I would have been asked to build the world's largest design program and to use design as the fundamental lever to transform a company that had been thoroughly disrupted? This was the state of things in 2012. We had 380,000 people. We worked in about 170 countries. We had virtually zero presence on the cloud. We were building 9,000 different products, all of which were products built for the old world of on-premise computing. Our revenues of about $80 billion were at stake. So we developed a framework that really rested on 3 simple questions. The first one, how do we change who is making the decision? We had to ensure that we got all the people in the room that needed to be there. One of the things we found early on is that when you don't have massively diverse teams and multidisciplinary teams, you're delaying some piece of feedback till later in the process. And so we embarked on a massive, what we call shift left, to start putting everybody, all of the stakeholders in a given product or solution in the room and on the team from the very beginning. We also had to get much more intentional about the teams themselves, ensuring that all the voices in the room, job number 1. That's not something that most organizations do. We typically start talking about this later in the cycle, but we're never as intentional up front with our team formation as we should be. The second thing we had to do is change why decisions got made. Decisions could no longer be about the technology. We had to stop worrying about the fact that, in our case, Watson existed, or blockchain exists, or some other technology exists. And we started to have to put the user at the center of our conversation and recognize that we were not our users. It turns out that as developers of digital assets and tools, we are seldom our users. It translates okay if you're building a consumer-facing application because you probably are going to consume that service, or you can certainly intuit that relatively easy. But if you're preparing an ad campaign, or if you're building a B2B application, if you're trying to increase the velocity of discovery for materials scientists, you are not that person. And we had to put that person in the room more intentionally. And to do that, we had to change the mindset of expertise that we had and bring in a little humility so that people understood we were not our users. And the third thing we had to do was we had to change how decisions were made. In the past, decisions were made based on requirements and requirements documents, and we had to move to a culture of prototyping. We had to start getting people to realize that everything is a prototype. In your life, every day is a prototype. Even something you release to market is a prototype. Everything is an opportunity to gain feedback from. And more important to this transformation of culture, we had to start teaching people that you always wanted to prototype at the lowest level fidelity as possible. We had to create sketchers of 380,000 people, people who were averse to making line drawings. And so we very intentionally brought in some of the things, and many of you may use, and many of you may some of you may ridicule things like Post-it note exercises. But these are very important because they only give you a finite amount of space. And introducing the correct Sharpie into that equation may seem silly, it may seem dumb. It turns out that the width of the mark actually restricts the amount you can write or draw in a given space. It forces low resolution storytelling. So we introduced this notion of prototyping, prototyping, and prototyping. And these three things became the basis for how we started to scale design thinking at IBM. We call it, creatively enough, Enterprise Design Thinking by IBM. It took us a while to land on that name, but it's based on these three things, and teaching an entire company of 380,000 people to focus more on the user and the user outcomes, to restlessly reinvent ourselves through low-fidelity prototyping as much as possible, and finally, to be more intentional about diversity and the creation of diverse, empowered teams. And this year, we were recognized by an International Foundation Award for Service Design for this platform. This platform now exists in digital form. By the way, it's available to the public. If you want to go to ibm.com/design/thinking, this isn't a commercial for it, but it exists. It's there. It's available for people to use. And we've actually surrounded this platform with a few scaling tactics. We created a badge so that we have practitioner badges for people who go through this. Now, what's interesting about how we've scaled this, we haven't just enabled design thinking. We don't just assemble a group of 1,000 people and say, we're going to teach you design thinking today, and it's just the same old thing. We actually focus solely on the outcomes. So the only way to get into the design program at IBM or have a project part of the design program is to bring the project to the table, and we will, in the early days of the team, use design thinking to accelerate the state and quality of that project. And in doing that, we are teaching the principles and practices of design thinking. We've now created 5 different certification levels. We actually have multiple levels for the practitioner. We found a notion, we used to call them magic people, we now call them coaches. There's a great book that's been released just in the last few months called The Coaches Class. And there's actually some empirical evidence now that is showing that the magic to a particular team generating an outcome is not about the manager, and it's not about the superstar. There's some magic person, there's some coach on that team, there's some individual on the team that provides some spark that leads to breakthrough outcomes and consistently great outcomes on teaches. We found that if we didn't have executive advocates, that teams were less likely to hit the mark. And so we created a very lightweight course for our executives. And now every executive at IBM has been acquainted with design thinking. And today we have 125,000 people practicing using these methods every single day. We created digital content around this. We have analog artifacts that we've created as well. We now have over 75 chapters, people who have stood up and said, in my spare time, I actually want to become an expert in this and bring people in my region into this way of working. And because of this, we're starting to get really interesting outcomes. This outcome is no longer relevant for most technical people anymore. It's too flat. There's too many articles. It doesn't give you any context for anything. And so really understanding deeply understanding specific domains of users, we can begin to bring forward breakthrough outcomes like this, where we combine really advanced analytics with artificial intelligence to bring context and meaning, in this case, to the domain of materials science. And we do that by scaling design research and by scaling the stories we tell and by scaling the focus on the people that actually are going to use the tool. And these people have seen discovery move from a Google-based world to an IBM AI-based world, from months down to weeks for new science discovery. We put these people through what we call the loop. The loop simply says this: we have to do this all the time, every day. We constantly have to observe the real people in the real world. We have to reflect on that, and we have to make a prototype. And we have to reflect on that and get feedback. And we have to observe people using it and reflect on that and make and reflect and observe and reflect, make. Over and over again, as many times as possible. And every now and then, we have to hit the release button and actually release the state of that thing to the world. In the past, I think, you could change what you worked on in order to transform yourself. You could build a list, even as a human being. But I don't think that's enough. I think today we have to change how we work. Every day. Every day is a prototype. That's what we've done at IBM. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah.
Quick question, because we're really out of time. I would like to know, how can we design social systems to maximize human well-being?
How do we design social systems to maximize human well-being? I think the main thing is you have to really I mean, to me, it's pretty simple. You've got to do the research. You've got to get out in the field. You've got to observe these people. We've done a lot of work with a couple of foundations around in the post-Harvey world in Houston, a foundation that is made up and promoting essentially crowdsourced first responders to acts of disaster. And I think one of the things that came to us is nobody, even that organization who's done it for 20 or so years, nobody understands the complexity of all of the stakeholders in any particular problem space. So number one is, I think, we have to do the research, and you really have to step back and say, who all is affected by the problem space that you're trying to deal with, and then do a deep dive and understand and gain empathy with every one of those stakeholders. If you think there's 10 people involved in a particular thing, I promise you it's closer to 100.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Phil. That was great.
Thanks
Thank you again.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.